Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 7th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Governor Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate in the 2024 presidential election. I apologize for not making any videos yesterday, but I wanted to go ahead and tell you that today I'm going to aim to put out quite a few, and I wanted to talk about a number of different topics ranging from the presidential election down to some other races that I find to be quite interesting in this election cycle. But most importantly, the news that broke yesterday was that Governor Tim Walz will now be the vice presidential nominee alongside Vice President Harris in this presidential election in a decision that marks probably one of the smartest political choices that the Kamala Harris for President campaign or Biden-Harris campaign has made this cycle alone. Kamala Harris choosing Tim Walz has now earned her praise on the side of the Democratic Party, which is entirely expected. But the range in which you see praise comes from anywhere from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, better known as AOC, and Senator Joe Manchin, who is now an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party. This wide range of approval even going out to candidates that had opposed President Biden in the primary, those who had thrown their names out there, people like Representative Dean Phillips, but more importantly, Marianne Williamson, who sure, her influence and her endorsement probably isn't swaying voters in this election. It does show a very much cohesive and put together Democratic Party in a way that we haven't seen over the past year and a half. And so Tim Walz now being this vice presidential nominee has also reeled in endorsements. We've seen endorsements from military groups and started to see praise from many different groups that have focused on the progressive movement, Democratic policy, a bunch of different things that the Democratic Party has been reliant on for electoral victories in many years past. And Kamala Harris and Tim Walz yesterday on the stage in Philadelphia really showed exactly what their partnership is going to look like. It looks like a very friendly one, a joyful one, as better put by Tim Walz. And the more we know about Tim Walz shows that he is arguably the best pick that Kamala Harris could have had and could have chosen in this election cycle. And we should go ahead and take a look. I want to spend some time talking first about the most important thing when it comes down to a vice presidential choice, and that is the issue of electability. Back in 2018, Tim Walz won in his governor's race, taking it from a competitive state. Hillary Clinton had won it by 1.5%. And Tim Walz was in this race, and he ended up winning by over 10 points. Now, an 11-point margin for Tim Walz was very impressive, and given where he was in the House of Representatives, he was on track for a very competitive House seat. Arguably, though, he was already in a very competitive House seat. There had barely been any Democrats who had served in the district before, and the district had become far more purple over the past few cycles, and so in 2018, he opted to run for governor instead. And so, he did, winning by 11 points statewide in a massive, massive victory, again in a state that Hillary Clinton only won by 1.5. 4 years later, after the environment on the national level shifted 8 points to the right of 2020, and based on 2018, the national environment shifted 11 points to the right, Minnesota saw a minor reduction in Tim Walz's margin, where he ended up winning by 7 points across the state against Scott Jensen. This margin of victory here was very reminiscent of that of President Biden in a year where Democrats should have been far, far, far underperforming the President of the United States. And so Tim Walz has an electoral track record that is proven. First elected in 2006 in Congress, went on to be governor, re-elected as governor, and has done quite well in the state. When you take a look at his approval too, voters like him. In July, the most recent Survey USA poll, which is one of the gold standard polls in the state of Minnesota. In the same poll, they show Kamala Harris with a 10-point lead, so she was already doing quite well in the state. He is approved of by 56% of respondents. And so not only will she do well in the state, or what she was expected to do well in the state herself, she will end up doing even better with Tim Walz on the ticket. Why? Because people in Minnesota like him. They find him to be likable, and arguably, so do Americans. We're finding that in direct comparisons. Tim Walz, the more that people know about him, the more they like him. We've noticed that as his name ID has gone up, his approval has also gone up. Very much in contrast with that of Senator J.D. Vance, who the more people know about him and the more that they do in fact find out that he is the running mate, and that this is the guy who's the name that is J.D. Vance, they end up liking him less. His approvals start to dip. His disapprovals start to skyrocket. That's not the case with Tim Walz. And granted, we don't have that many national polls or that many points of interest, though the very public Veep stakes have made it so we've had 2 weeks of polls of discussions around Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear, Tim Walz, and approval polls that have been taken nationally. And so that's pretty fair. But looking at where we are from here on out, the direct point of comparison will come out in the next 1, 2, 3 weeks. And if you watch Tim Walz on the debate stage, if you watched Tim Walz on the stage last night in Philadelphia, you will know that, again, his story is a story to be told, and it really comes in at a very unique point in time where there's a lot of conversation around unifying the country, a lot of conversation around grassroots organizing and getting people inspired and excited to vote. Tim Walz does exactly that. And so from the title of this video, you can tell I am fully under the assumption and fully believing, because I think this to be true, that Tim Walz was the right choice to meet this moment. And so the New York Times has this article here where they talk about the VP facts of Tim Walz, 19 facts about him that you need to know for his being the pick as vice president. And I just want to walk you through it to understand exactly why I have always believed from practically the beginning that Tim Walz is probably the most electable and safest choice for the Kamala Harris for president campaign. And we can go ahead and take a look. So some of these things I don't think matter as much as they should, but not even necessarily as they should, don't matter as much to the average voter. For instance, this first point here about him being a very recent social media darling. Sure, that can matter in swaying and turning out young voters, but on the grand scheme of things, I don't think that was a massive choice or decision maker in why Kamala Harris chose him for vice president. A thing that I do think mattered a lot was the fact that he started this whole weird characterization around Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, because now it has gone far and wide in Democratic and independent politics, and Republicans are not positively responding to it. There's a number of facts here, too, that I think are largely irrelevant for the Veep stakes, but still very much can build a cohesive image around Tim Walz, who he is as a person, who he is as VP, because the majority of Americans, in every poll, have no idea who Tim Walz is. So this is, again, another opportunity for the Democratic Party to reshape an image of someone who has, sure, seen some level of national spotlight in different instances, like in 2020 when he was the governor, what we also saw in 2022. Most recently, with the uncommitted vote in the state of Minnesota, he was up on multiple news networks talking about, President Biden. And so what I find to be the most interesting is that because his approval rating is so, not approval rating, because his name ID is so low, it allows the Democratic campaign to build out a narrative about him and broadcast his story. And I think that's what we're starting to see here. And so again, this is all about helping you understand how Democrats are going to build an image and a message around who he is as a person, because it absolutely matters. He has been doing everything right, seemingly so, since the beginning of his political career. Has been seemingly doing everything right in his own actual career. And it is really interesting to watch to see exactly how little, but how much we will soon know over the next 90 days. So one thing that I think has been really prevalent in Tim Walz as a candidate, as a person, is the fact that he was a high school teacher, that he got his bachelor's degree and he became a history teacher for high school. On top of that, too, he became a high school football coach. With that being said, at the same time, he also sponsored the Gay Straight Alliance in the 1990s at his high school as the football coach, saying that it was important because he was a soldier, he's a veteran, I haven't mentioned that yet, and he was straight and was married. And it was important that that was there and was done at his high school because it showed and sent a message to students across the high school. I mean, this guy is not some type of, Democratic politician who was unearthed 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago even, who has taken bad policy positions before, but not so much now. And I think while we didn't really see that in these Veep stakes, I do think that that breed of politician is what turns away some American voters. I mean, we can see that some people who have gone from, for instance, people that run for office after being oil executives or hedge fund managers, right? That's not always the type of vibe that the American public would come to know and love, because that's just not how the average American comes up and ends up in positions like this. Tim Walz has that story. He, again, was a high school football coach, a high school teacher. He was a veteran. He enlisted at 17. He'd been abroad. He also was ranked the 7th most bipartisan member of Congress. 7th most bipartisan member of Congress. That's crazy, talking about 435 members. I mean, Tim Walz has a very strong track record that he can very much run on. And in terms of what he got done in the state of Minnesota, he was rated an A rating from the NRA until he decided that he was going to push for common sense gun reform. That's his own words, and that's how he describes it. That's how Democrats are going to message this. I mean, he has images of himself hunting recently, images of himself shooting guns. He has a story that can be told from the perspective of a service member, of a public school teacher, of a gun owner, of someone who has really taken very strong political positions in the past that have ended up being the right political positions for the party in terms of where they are aligned. He has a very strong story in terms of his faith. He talks about IVF because his wife underwent IVF treatments at a time where IVF is now being voted on in the United States Senate, and Republicans are voting entirely party line against it. We are finding here that he has a story to be told, and one the Democrats are absolutely going to pounce on and use to their advantage. And that's exactly why Tim Walz was so electable in the first place in 2018 in Minnesota and again in 2022. Now, in terms of national shift, I already was under the assumption that Kamala Harris would narrowly win this election. I don't think this is a blowout. As much as it seems like the energy has revitalized on the Democratic side, it's largely matching, if not slightly exceeding, what Republicans have been having. But that isn't to say that that is the sign of a landslide ticket. We do have to understand that this campaign is really close, no matter what anybody says, no matter what any poll says. And even the polls agree with me. This race is going to come down to the wire. We are going to be up through the late evening on election night, and Donald Trump very well could be the next president of the United States. But at the same time, so could Vice President Harris, in a way that President Biden was very much the underdog for practically the entirety of the race. Kamala Harris is also the underdog. She is not the person who is coming into this with as much momentum up until recently, as much enthusiasm up until recently, as much money up until recently. And now the tides are turning. In a month from now, could she be top dog? Could she be the one who's coming into this and now on track to win the election with pretty, secure states, winning battlegrounds by larger margins than where she is today? Absolutely. But that time has yet to come. And if I was to call the election today, I do think, based on what we're seeing on the ground, based on what we're seeing in the polls, based on what we're seeing in approval rating, based on what we're seeing in terms of enthusiasm, is that Kamala Harris can narrowly win the presidency, and that Tim Walz gets her across the finish line by shoring up some of these states. For instance, Minnesota, a state that just most recently got moved over into the likely Democratic column, according to Larry Sabato's crystal ball. That makes sense. But what it also means, Donald Trump just opened 10 campaign field offices in Minnesota. Why? Because he almost won the state in 2016, but got trounced in 2020 by swing state standards. Now I can imagine they'll be closing all of those offices. They'll be closing their efforts in Minnesota. Because with Tim Walz on the ticket, love him or hate him, he wins the state. And that it means Democrats can spend less money on Minnesota. It also means that in the Rust Belt region, Democrats now have a ticket that is even better for the Rust Belt. The Kamala Harris-Donald Trump matchup on the standalone, I had Kamala Harris narrowly winning Wisconsin, maybe winning Pennsylvania, narrowly winning in Michigan. Now I'd say pretty securely that we could be on track for 1 to 2 point victories in Wisconsin, 2 to 3 point victories in Michigan, and 1 to 2 point victories in Pennsylvania. Far better than being up by 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 in estimations. Tim Walz adds to the ticket by securing up that Rust Belt region, locking down his home state. And again, Kamala Harris, when she came into this race, all we talked about was that she added a tremendous benefit in the Sun Belt region. She could inspire Latino voters in Arizona the same way she did in California. She can use her regional advantage in the Southwest, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, California. That she would inspire black voters in Raleigh and Atlanta, and also turn out suburbanites, white suburbanites to be specific, that also were integral in electing Democrats back in 2020 in Georgia and North Carolina as well. That Kamala Harris could show some level of reducing Trump support in states like Florida. Because what we know to be consistent across the polls, Biden versus Harris era, is that Biden was always underperforming Kamala Harris amongst minority voters. Even if Kamala Harris saw some levels of reduction amongst Republican voters, which is interesting, but sort of makes sense, right? They were fine with Biden because he wasn't as progressive in perception as Kamala Harris, and they couldn't stomach Trump, but now they may not be willing to vote for Kamala Harris. Sure. White voters, we saw a slight reduction, but now we're starting to see improvements amongst every demographic group. Those were all the pre-polls. That's what we knew going into the immediate swap out. And now we're starting to see that it is getting even better with Tim Walz on the ticket here, winning over those white voters, winning over the white working class in the Rust Belt region, winning over swing voters in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, because Tim Walz, again, comes from a purple district. He comes from a Trump district that he wins in. He knows how to win Trump country, so he knows how to win the Rust Belt because he's from the Rust Belt. He was born in Nebraska, raised his family in Minnesota. He knows what he's doing, electability. He's never lost an election, and I think that is a very, very important thing to keep in mind as well. Because neither Kamala Harris or Tim Walz have lost an election. Through the general election, haven't lost it. And so looking at this duality, this ticket here, it is very clear that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have what it takes to win the election. But it'll still be very close. I think she made the right choice with Tim Walz, undeniably. I don't think there could have been a better option. I think Josh Shapiro would have been strong. I think Mark Kelly would have been strong. Tim Walz is stronger. And that's clear. The enthusiasm and energy we saw yesterday and across social media, and the unification of the far left and the center left, shows exactly why the Democratic Party is now at a point of unification. Democrats are in array. Democrats are in a position where they are on track to win this election for the first time this year. And Tim Walz has made that all far more possible. The election, again, to final point here, I've said it multiple times this video, will be close. But Kamala Harris will be in a position that is far, far, far better than where President Biden left off. And Democrats, for that reason alone, should be very happy, but not complacent. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.